Hi everybody, welcome back to the Reaper 101 tutorial series with me, Adam Steele. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about the stock plugins that are built into Reaper and how to get quite a lot of use out of them before looking for any kind of external plugins that you can go and get separately. Before we do, I'm going to mention again that in each part of this series that this is brought to you by the Pro Mix Academy Ultimate Reaper Guide. The whole new version that's available on Pro Mix Academy is in extreme detail and shows you everything you need to know about working with Reaper from start to finish, including recording, mixing, mastering, much more detail than you've got here, all the extra cool stuff, and just generally everything that we could possibly throw at it. So the link is down in the description below. Now, Reaper does come with quite a few of its own effects that you can use. They are not particularly pretty because the stock kind of general theme and look of these things is designed to be very basic, but also very light on processor usage. So you can go absolutely crazy with numbers of processors wherever you need them without dragging your system down too much, which means if you've got an older system or a slower system, you can still use as many as you need. The first one that I'm going to use is one that's one that I use every day, which is the stock EQ in Reaper, which is Re-EQ. All the Reaper plugins start with REA for Reaper, then whatever the name is. In this case, REA EQ, and I'm going to add that onto our track we've been using. Under all plugins, I clicked in the blank space here above on the mixer where you can add insert effects. That's what I'm doing on the JHS track. And to whittle down the big list of plugins that I have, I'm going to go onto our bar on the left and click Cocos, because that's the name of the company that makes Reaper. And so all of their plugins come in here, and down this list we see Re-EQ. Now, another very handy shortcut that I should say right now is if you know the exact name of a plugin and you've got a big scary list like this, you can start typing that name in the filter at the top. So if I type REAE, there we go. And so with any plugin that's got a really long name, if you start typing the first few letters, that usually whittles it right down to just a few. In this case, it's a VST that's Re-EQ. Let's double click it and open that up. And I'm going to drag the bottom right of this to make it bigger. So if I hit play from here, this is currently a 4-band EQ. You can see 1, 2, 3, 4. And if I hit play, you can see there what's called an FFT. That's that big yellow line, and that's showing us how much of things like low end, mid-range, treble this track has, and it's overlaid exactly over the frequency numbers you see at the bottom here, 50, 100, 200, 300, etc. That whatever you see corresponds. So if you see a big spike at say 1K, that's the frequency range where that big noise is coming from. So in the case of this track, we can see the low end on the kick drum going bump, bump, bump in the low here. And we can see the hi-hat going tick, 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 tick at the top. Same applies to if you're using an EQ on any individual instrument or group of instruments. You'll see exactly what's going on in the frequencies. So if you can hear any problems like a kind of a whistle frequency or anything kind of untoward, very likely you'll see it on that FFT view. Now by default, there are 4 bands on the Reaper EQ. You can have as many or as few as you like. At the bottom, you can either add a band or remove a band. So I've now got 8 bands. And they appear both as a tab here with 3 sliders, and also they appear on this line here visually, so I can slide them around to where I need them. Let's just reset this with the presets back to factory default. so we can keep it simple for a minute. As you saw at the top there are a whole host of stock presets. I'm not much of a preset man myself. I personally like to use tools to find problems and correct them and exactly boost or enhance things that I want to and not what someone else has done. But if you like presets, there's a lot of them to be found right there. Now let's start with band 2 because this is a regular old band. If I drag this around, you'll see a big kind of hump appear. And what's happening there is we're controlling 2 of those sliders down the bottom. We're controlling the frequency and the gain. So up and down controls how much or how little of this effect we're going to be doing. So like this. And so if your gain is at 0, then nothing's happening, so it doesn't actually matter which frequency is chosen. The frequency is where we go left to right. So that determines whether we're boosting low end, some of the mid-range, higher up, even higher, like so. And at the end there, did you notice that that kind of went away? I double clicked on the dot and that bypassed or disabled that band. If I double click it again, it comes back. Very good tool for if you're not sure whether what you're doing is the right thing or not. You can very quickly turn that on and off. So you can turn it back to how it was before and go, was it better before? Is it better now? The third control is the bandwidth, otherwise known as octave. So that's a more of a musical term, octave, but we can determine how pinpoint sharp this EQ is, or generally kind of broad and affecting everything. With it being like this, like a super sharp thing, we'll get a very kind of resonant nong 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 kind of sound. The really specific kind of stuff can be really useful if you find a frequency somewhere that you really don't like and you want to remove it. You're not then taking out everything else around it. So you can be really quite subtle so that someone who's listening to a track that you've produced might not be aware that you've made this little EQ move at all, which for me is often a goal of what I'm trying to achieve. However, the band is not the only type of EQ control. There are different types. If we look at band number 1, by default, there is this type list, and that is a low shelf. So what that means is as I drag this round, instead of that kind of hump, we get a big, broad kind of low frequency, either cut or a big boost. And dragging this around with the frequency determines where that starts, so how much of the kind of the mid-range and the upper bass that affects, or just the sub entirely. Same with band 4, by default is a high shelf, and that affects the ultra top end, but it kind of keeps going up instead of being specific. There are other types we can play with too. There's a low pass, which is a filter, which entirely removes everything from the top end. And when we play with the octave on that, that gives us what we call a resonant peak, which sounds a bit like a wah-wah when we move it around. I see a lot of dance producers using this resonant peak technique so that they can make what they're doing sound obvious. So when they move things around, it becomes more kind of, oh, right. Whereas with a high pass, that's exactly the opposite. And again, we're removing the low end. That's a really resonant filter. There we go. The There are a few other types. I wouldn't worry about all pass unless you're getting into working with phase. There's a notch type which does exactly as advertised, which completely removes a frequency, which can be quite a dangerous thing. Be careful with that. And then there's band pass, which does the opposite of a notch and just lets a certain amount through. And then the other types are kind of leftover vestigial things. Now let's delete that and look at compression. So we want to type in for recomp, so REACOM. And there it is, before I've even finished typing, recomp. And this one has quite a scary amount of controls, but we'll try and demystify them a little bit now. So if you've not used a compressor before, the way that I would think about a compressor is it's basically just a volume kind of slider, but it works on its own based on what we tell it to do. The first two controls which I'll look at hand in hand are the threshold and the ratio. So the way to think about this is as we give this more volume of the track, there will be a certain point, the threshold, which we determine where that threshold is, beyond which we start to get compression. And how much compression really depends on the ratio. So we're determining where we want compression to start and how much we want it to do. Now, with the ratio, the best way to explain that, let's say 2:1. Above that threshold, that level that we set, any more volume that comes in, we're only going to let half of that back out. So for every 2 that we get in, only 1 gets out. So if we went to 4:1, every 4 that go in, only 1 comes out. So we can go from a very, very subtle, very gentle kind of compression, like you might get on a mixed bus or in a master maybe 1.5:1 that's just kind of leveling everything together, all the way through to infinity to 1. So above that level where we're setting, nothing else will get through. So the volume has to be pulled down as much as is needed to stop that getting any louder. So what we're going to do is let's start with 4:1 ratio. It tends to be kind of a good number that I like. It's a number that I find on a lot of classic hardware compressors like these ones behind me, where they have a button for 4, and it works quite well in a lot of cases. So from here I'm going to hit play and bring this threshold down until something happens. Now you should be able to hear there that something changed, something happened, and those kick drums, that were the loudest part of the track, when they hit, the whole thing would go whoa and come down, and we could see this big red meter here that would do exactly that, because that's what's happening. When that red meter goes down, the volume of this track is being pulled down by that much. So those are the first 2 controls that you'll want to play with on a compressor. Beyond that, we're looking at attack and release to really kind of define how it sounds. So I'm going to start with release. For me, release really determines how a compressor sounds. If I make this really slow, so that's a really big number, let's say 2 seconds or 2000 milliseconds, what this is going to do now is it's going to be like with radio stations when they kind of try and bring everything squished together so that each song on the radio kind of has its general volume all in one place, but all the details are generally kind of kept. So that's what this is now going to do. And you can see that red line there really holds, and those big kick drums are kind of keeping that in line so that the whole song just gets quieter, especially after that first big hit, and then everything stays together. That's exactly what a lot of FM radio stations do. But you can really hear that kind of volume pumping thing. A lot of dance producers use that as an effect. I'm not a big fan of it personally. I tend to go the other way with my release and have it very fast, so a very small number. And that means that when that big hit comes, in this case a big kick drum, by the time that hit has finished hitting and that volume came down, it's already pretty much shot straight back up. And you can see that level really kind of flicking around much more quickly. The downside to using a really fast release is you have the potential to be able to hear that almost like a distortion and a kind of a wobbling effect. The attack does the kind of the first part, so depending on how much of that initial hit you want to let through, you modify your attack. If we have a really slow attack, that means that the compressor very slowly starts clamping down, which means that initial hit is really kept, and we should now hear that. Now that I've made this a much slower attack, so a much bigger number, we should hear much more of a dumph, dumph on this kick. That's a trick that can be used on drums or other sources, but drums are a really good example of this, where you can use this now to make a drum that didn't have very much of that boom kind of attack have more of that, and then so you'll have less of that kind of ring in the drum and more of the attack is left behind. And then if it's quiet, you can just bump the volume up of everything overall, which is called makeup gain, and then you should feel like that initial hit, that attack, that transient is louder than it was before. There is an auto makeup switch on here, which if I click that, we should find that everything gets a lot louder because we've brought the threshold down 17 dB. This is going to bring the output level up by the same amount. Generally, I don't go with auto makeup in these kind of situations because that can end up being really strange, but that can work in your favor. I find, and I'm going to try the attack almost on 0, that's going to completely flatten out this set of drums in this track and make it very kind of sat in one place, and it's really going to be kind of locked down without any kind of hit. I find that's really useful on vocals as an example. If you really need a vocal to really sit in one place in a mix, you can keep a really fast attack so that it just kind of sits there. And then if that's too fast, you need a little bit more of that kind of kick of a consonant, that tick tick boom kind of thing. You can then play with the attack a little to let a bit more of that through. So let's have a listen to this with a fast attack. So you can hear how that's really leveling things out, but also that kick drum now is making everything go bwomp, bwomp, because the low end of that is making the compressor react a lot. So what we can do to try and stop that is we can use these low and high pass controls on the detector, or the thing that makes the compressor go squish. So what I would do there is bring the high pass up and listen for when it stops doing the low end squishy thing. And after that, you could see I brought the threshold down even more, because now the low end isn't making the compression jump all over the place. I can use more compression to keep everything together without the low end causing everything to squish and kind of jump all over the place. I could also do a low pass to stop things like the hi-hats from triggering the compressor, but that's less of an issue most of the time. Like I said, you can hear there's kind of almost a distortion in there now, because the attack and release are kind of fighting each other, so you really do have to find the ideal kind of setup for what's working for your instruments that you're working with. Now, if this isn't enough, if you want the low end, the mid-range and the high end to be separately controlled, you're going to need a multiband compressor. And that's where we bring in Re-X Comp. This has a lot more going on. It's very similar controls to what we just saw in Recomp, times 4. Or more or less. You can add bands, you can delete bands. Quite often on something like a bass guitar, I might have 2 bands, one that is just doing compression on just the low end, and one that's for everything else, because that way the compression can keep the low end solid without making the rest of the instrument kind of dance around all over the place. In mastering, we often use 3 or 4 bands to try and level things out separately without being obvious in a kind of sound way. In fact, there are some really good presets in here. Try the Super Smooth 3 band and see how that works for you. But you'll also see that this has that FFT much like the EQ plugin did. But above that, we can click on one of these and it will give us some controls. If I drag this down, you can see that's bringing the threshold down on that band. If I change the ratio, you can see how a little kind of orange circle is coming up on that band, so we can see how aggressive that is. And when I press play, you can see numbers come up on this particular band of how much and how quickly that's compressing. So we can use that to our advantage to know exactly how much compression is happening. So if we bring down all 3 bands, we can see that separately the low end, the mids, and the highs are all being compressed in their own way to keep them in place without sounding like really obvious pumping compression. Multibands can be used for a whole host of things. There is a preset here for de-essing, so there's a band here that would be on a really sharp S. That can also be used to do things like tame hi-hats. There are so many things you can do. Another one that you might use is retune. Retune firstly looks like a guitar tuner because you can use it as such. But you can also use the tabs here for correction, so you can automatically pitch correct this, much like a kind of auto-tune style idea. Or you can go to manual correction, which is more of a kind of a, well, it's more like a Melodyne kind of idea. If I was to play something in, let's make this bigger. It doesn't work so well on a whole song. It would work better on like a single vocal or something like that. But then once the pitches are in, I can then draw lines to define what the pitch should be, and it should keep the pitch in that line, but only when we tell it to, which can be very powerful for pitch correcting small amounts of a track. There are plenty more plugins, like there's a delay, there's a gate, there's the reinsert plugin, which we'll talk about later because that's to do with outboard hardware. And there are some really funky things. There's resurround pan, which we'll talk about in the surround sound kind of sections. But that's as much as I'm going to go into in this section of the video. I go into real detail with all of these in the Ultimate Reaper Guide from Pro Mix Academy, which the link is down in the description below. But for now, that's me. The next episode is going to be all about using third-party plugins and what that entails and what you might need, and getting those running in some very clever ways. So thanks everybody for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.